systems in place by the Confederate rackets, such as the war facilitation, from the war on terror to the other wars in the Middle East, which were generated for the specific uh, moving of resources from the broader public into centralized hands, as the insurgents, separate to the function of the military industrial complex, are loyal to exclusively extra law functions, which is terrorist KKK extremities, at which point the ingestion of these specialized Confederate militia units are redirected values for the Confederacy centralized resources and prosperity for the development of their war against the United States, with a systematic replacement, at which point they generate policies of magic, which are the declaration of the obligation in order to acquire their mission, such as the exceeding of their rank in order to engage in the compulsion of their action, in order to facilitate the implementation of their Confederate policy or general construction, as their strategies or contingencies to overthrowing the United States requires the stabilizing of their secondary Confederate systems, such as the military overthrow of the United States through the Confederate interest, at which point you have systems in place where the judiciary and legislature are told that they have to comply in subjugation to the executive, because that is the objective of the contingency of the Confederates, which is the breach of the co-equal branches of the American government, which is their fundamental and inherent enemy. At which point you have these fraudulent systems systematically replacing the United States until it is functionally unrecognizable by comparison, at which point the implementation of their beginnings of these procedures would be when they would have started targeting David Bowles as a character who is assumed to be General of the United States Intelligence Oversight, which would have discovered these functions, which means by definition they are the contingencies generated at the point of the Confederate intent to overthrow the United States. At which point you have systematic rackets, which are normalized throughout the inherent system for the engagement of these frauds and Ponzi schemes, and the application of these Ponzi schemes, such as the homeless epidemic, qualifies their ability to redirect resources away from the original economy, at which point they artificially, through the secrets, created the homelessness problem to begin with, at which point the destabilized, moved public and alterated economy and contracts qualifies people's artificial vulnerability, at which point the enforcement of that artificial vulnerability, such as the refusal to assist vets in products and agreements which were owed to them, generating the position of many of them being discarded as burdens to society, are specifically the irony of the Confederate order, which gives false support of supporting the troops, at which point you understand that the irony of supporting the troops until you have to do anything that would require supporting the troops in question qualifies the dismantlement of logic from the systematic position into a position of generated slogans, and these contest of slogans allows for the homelessness problem in question, which, having been created by their secret terrorism of destabilized communities such as COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and military false science experiments conducted without consent or knowledge by the victims, creates the homelessness exponential problems, at which point the traumatized publics, which are systematically moved around as they are highly mobile, as they do not have a foundational home, as they have been destabilized and thus cannot grow roots, qualifying the position of the artificial market generated by these social engineers engaged in these secret terrorist operations, qualifying the obligation of releasing the secret terrorist operations in order to track the function of the original economy, which was traumatized by Confederate warmongers. These Confederate terrorist organizations have engaged in the fraudulent exponential position of generating deals with local and state governments in order to solve the artificially created homeless epidemic, such as, but is not limited to, the function of their War on David, where they attacked their target or targets and enforced engagement of the use of government insurances, such as the intention of creating Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid type extra government functions in the insurance of the general public, at which point you have the compulsion towards the exacerbation of the accounts into artificial desperation by government terrorist attacks, which, being concealed by the position, prevents them from engaging in the correct remedy from the government criminal organization, which is the ones who are liable to pay, at which point you have the depletion of the accounts, at which point you have the compulsion in compliance with the government social programs, at which point you have an artificial customer base. These artificial customer bases being completely separate to a real American economy generates a bunch of Ponzi schemes which they've generated for the specific position of centralizing the power and money from the government, specifically designed to overcharge and underdeliver, maximizing the minimum function of each of the things, generating the position of a perpetual racket, at which point there's an old video game where there's a puzzle that you have to move around as a taxi man, and that taxi man has to weigh the price of distance traveled and the price of gas in their tank, and the act of moving around the puzzle so that you can get to the end before you run out of gas, but at the same time have the road take long enough so that you can engage in larger returns, as it is fundamentally that type of scheme, qualifying the engagement of the subversion of the real economy, which would not have had these traumatized positions, at which point you have the acknowledged position that there is an obligation to observe the uncensored economy, which is obstructed by these criminal suppressions, qualifying our obligation to engage in the replacement of the artificial contracts for the real contracts, at which point you would have to finish a full-grade investigation of the terrorist coup by the Confederate warmongers in order to know how big the problem is in question by comparison, at which point the difference between those two are free margins immediately to be delivered to the victims, at which point you have the engagement of the discovery of the real homeless epidemic, at which point it may or may not equate to an actual substantive epidemic, at which point you have the observation of the original contracts which observe David's network, which would have engaged through his brokerage, qualifying his relationships with political members of the government, as he would have developed his own political party and would have actively engaged in many political trades, including the trades of collecting and distributing the contracts over those subjects, at which point the price specifically attached to them may be paid in dollars, or it may be paid in favors, or in other normal political currency, or personal agreements, which would be normal to power brokering, which is the functional assumption of David's network's purpose, as David Bowles is the broker, at which point the financial job and political currency by the political broker, by the economic broker, by the work broker, would qualify the mechanism and consistent organization by which to facilitate the use of the structure in order to engage in these full solutions, increasing the liability of the terrorist organizations which are specifically targeting the mechanism of the stability. Now, Lindsey Graham from the record accused David of this, which means they specifically had in mind that David would be doing this. At which point, Lindsey Graham's assumption from that kangaroo court in secret by terrorists for insurrection to justify child abuse against David and many other children who they view with malicious contempt as they are Americans, would view David and the rest of them as Americans, as the justification of them being held as an enemy combatant to their government, which is the Confederate KKK insurrectionist organization. The insurgent KKK operation facilitates our engagement into the justification of the alteration of the economy and structure as a whole, at which point you have the acknowledgement that David would have won those contracts instead of the replacements, qualifying the use of David's structure from his brokerage under the normal agreement between him and the states and cities, etc., in order to engage in the use of his structure for the resolution of these basic community issues. At which point, David, having won those contracts, would be paid the equivalent of the remaining market, which is only possible for the war against the United States by the Confederacy, at which point you have the system of overthrowing the American states by the Confederate militia, which have infiltrated the military, which originally stopped the Nazi loyalists from the FBI, and then were infiltrated by the Nazi loyalists, qualifying their willingness to cooperate with the Confederate overthrow of the United States for the engagement of their unique fascist feudalist structure under the wizard terrorist organization. And this false republic by KKK terrorists facilitates our current justification for the existence of all of our problems currently, at which point we need to systematically engagement in the investigation of the replacement of all insurgents, which would assume itself as the foundation of the overthrow of the states, qualifying the Confederate policies and customs being viewed as above the law, which has engaged in criminal traumas against the American public across the United States and planet. At which point you have the obligation of the Americans to engage in the duel for the overthrow and purging of the Confederates, at which point you acknowledge that the Confederates have overthrown the republics in the states, qualifying the states having to be subject to martial law for the restructuring and ordering of the legal vote, which has to be qualified and certified through those loyal to the United States exclusively, which requires such things as the standard normalization without complication of all of those mechanisms, at which point gerrymandering and other fundamental complications have to be systematically purged for us to have a competent overview and observation of a legal vote, which must be held with more aggressive scrutiny as to protect it from the insurgent terrorist threats and subversions, which allows us to validate the actual substantive vote in order to engage in an actual substantive American republic. And the systems of the majority choosing their government has to ignore the functions of all otherwise elected members of government, which cannot be verified until after the vote is finished, which tells us the system of all of the extra checks conducted, which would have been infiltrated by the Confederacy as a mechanism of obstruction, which would have to be functionally ignored for the majority vote. At which point, when you have the system of the majority vote, you have to purge the felons loyal to the Confederacy, at which point all who are objectively understood in the investigation as loyal to Confederate customs must be purged as felons, engaging in war crimes against American civilians in order to stabilize the United States, for their loyalty to the Great Reset, which is the overthrow of governments around the world, and loyalty to the creation of revelation from the Bible for the one world fascist government under Satan, which could theoretically, from the record, be validated as an active motive, as they have systematically repeated it with aggressive validations and any use of violence in order to oppose any subversion of it being manufactured, is equivalent to criminal motive, at which point you have that position of creation of the revelation plot through the Great Reset for the Confederacy, at which point the collapse of the Europeans in the Great Reset qualifies the use of the Confederate overthrow of the weakened Europeans, qualifies the one world government under the Confederate loyalties, which is their functional plot in practice, at which point David being restrained and going through the Satanist programs would actively be their justification for attacking him on key issues, such as their attack against his study of religion, which they assumed he would have been a pastor without them, and their attack against his sexual nature, at which point you have the systematic sexual harassment by their false accusations and wish lists, qualifying their ability to satisfy their own fantasies through the mechanism of their secret equipment, qualifying their harassment campaigns as the functional position of two key examples in the creation of the Antichrist, which can be studied inside the Bible, at which point you would be able to discover upon their key loyalties in how they're trying to craft their loyalty to Revelation Satanism, as attacking his sexuality is fundamental to the eradication of the human race, and the attack against his religion is essential to the eradication of the human race, and the non-service of law, use of force, and the obstruction of justice, and the function of not having a remedy to a secret, or not being able to prosecute or have a remedy to new actions, which equates to old actions which have historically been obstructed, as they are validated by Confederate terrorism, would be functional representations of the loyalty to Revelation Satanism, which is the functional intent to seek the eradication of Jews as a sacrifice in order to summon God to be killed so that they can steal heaven, as their purpose in life is the extermination of God's law, God's nature, and God himself.